So what's my point? Let's bring this back around to Peter Boghossian's thesis. He wants to say that a commitment to the correspondence theory of truth, or what I've argued is better described as philosophical realism, is an important fault line for Culture War 2.0. Why? Because he thinks it's central to the Enlightenment tradition of critical inquiry in science and critical reasoning more broadly. But I don't think this is right. You can be committed to critical inquiry in science and critical thinking in general, of the kind that Boghossian admires, without being committed to a realist philosophy of science. So the crux of the issue isn't the correspondence theory of truth or philosophical realism. The crux has to do with the real worries that people like Boghossian have about the impact that progressive postmodern philosophies of science, a certain type of anti-realism about science, will have on the quality of the knowledge that is generated by science. But it's not a rejection of realism as such that threatens the quality of knowledge production. What threatens it is a rejection of a certain conception of how science should be practiced. So, what is this conception? What is required to generate this kind of knowledge? Well, this isn't an easy question, but it is a lot easier than resolving the realism-anti-realism debate. Here's how I prefer to think about these issues. And I think most practicing scientists think about these issues. The key to understanding scientific methodology is that the collection of methods and protocols that fall under this label that we've developed over the past 200 or so years, these are all strategies that we have designed to reduce or mitigate the errors that human beings are prone to make. Because the reality is that left to our own devices, human beings are really quite terrible scientists. We are prone to confirmation bias. We're persuaded too easily by anecdotal evidence. We don't weigh evidence properly. We see patterns where there aren't any, and we attribute causal meaning to patterns that are often meaningless, and the list goes on and on. That's why we developed statistical techniques for analyzing data and for testing hypotheses. That's why we developed the methodology of blind, randomized, controlled studies. That's why we worry about sample size and replicability. That's why we publish in peer-reviewed journals. It's because we really suck at this. But there is another important part of the story. Another key factor that is central to successful science has to do with a certain set of intellectual virtues. These are habits and dispositions and values that improve the quality of our reasoning and the knowledge we produce, like intellectual curiosity, open-mindedness, honesty, humility, and so on. So we have strategies for reducing errors, and we have intellectual virtues. These are central to scientific reasoning and the critical spirit. Now, obviously, I'm not saying anything earth-shattering here. I'm just saying that if we're interested in preserving what's really important about the Enlightenment tradition of reasoning critically about the world, this is where the focus of our attention should be. These are the norms and the practices and the social structures that we need to defend and protect. And notice that none of this requires a commitment to any particular realist philosophy of science, any particular view about the nature of reality, or the limits of scientific knowledge. You can be a die-hard anti-realist about science and still support all of this. So, time to wrap up. The upshot of this whole discussion is really just to make a suggestion for how to talk about this first component of Peter's thesis about a new kind of culture war. The component that talks about truth and knowledge and objective facts. I haven't said anything explicitly about free speech or the rules of engagement, as he calls it, and I haven't said anything about identity politics or the philosophy of identity. My suggestion was that what's really important here has to do with a certain conception of how we should practice science, and more broadly, how to think critically about the world. Now, if this is really under attack, then I'm on board with the call to defend it. Now, I also appreciate that any defense of critical thinking and scientific reasoning is going to have implications for the speech issue. On its face, we don't want to incentivize norms and a culture that censors the kind of speech that is essential to the social structures that actually implement this conception of critical thinking and scientific reasoning. But it is a separate question just how concerned we should be about freedom of speech in the sciences and in academia. Now, I know that Boghossian and others who identify with this culture war narrative have very strong feelings about this, but I take that as a separate question and needs a separate analysis because it raises a whole different set of social and political issues.